Hello, this is Robbie Mitchell from Head in the Cloud Development, here to give you a quick walkthrough of how to use REST Web Services in NetSuite. This video is being recorded in November 2022 using NetSuite version 2022.2. So here's what we're going to cover in this video. First, I'm going to show you how to create a REST Web Services integration and connect it using token-based authentication in Postman. From there, I'll show you how to get existing records and understand the JSON structure that REST Web Services uses. Next, we'll look at what it takes to create and update existing records in NetSuite, customers and sales orders, for instance. And finally, we'll look at how to run SuiteQL queries to search NetSuite via the integration. So what do you need to get started? First, you should have the administrator role in NetSuite to do everything I do here. Second, you'll need the Postman app. You can get it for free from postman.com if you don't already have it. So let's get to it. So I've logged into NetSuite here, and the first thing we need to do is make sure that the REST Web Services feature is enabled. To do that, let's go to Setup, Company, Enable Features. Here, let's go to the Suite Cloud tab, and let's look down under the Suite Talk section. Here we just want to make sure that REST Web Services is checked. And while we're here, let's also make sure token-based authentication is enabled. And now it's worth mentioning that the REST Web Services API is relatively new. It's only been around for a couple of years now. That being said, not all record types are in general availability yet. Some are still in beta. That's what this beta checkbox here relates to. To see what I mean, let's look at the API documentation here. Note this URL. Notice this beta checkbox here at the top of the page. If I unselect it, quite a few records disappear from the list here. Those are the ones that are still in beta. For example, customer payments don't show up here in general availability, but if I switch beta mode back on, then they do show up. We're just going to focus on the records that are in general availability for now, customers and sales orders. So I'm going to go to the customer documentation section here. And I'm going to keep this up, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's switch back to NetSuite for a minute. So back in NetSuite, the features are enabled, and the next step is to create an integration. To do this, go to Setup, Integration, Manage Integrations, and New. I'm just going to name mine Robbie REST Web Services 2022. Here in authentication, token-based authentication is already selected. I'm just going to uncheck the checkbox for TBA authentication flow, as well as the OAuth 2.0 section below. And then I'm going to save my integration. Now don't navigate away from this page yet, because this is the only time it's going to show you these credentials. So the second thing we need is to create our access token. So leaving this page open, I'm going to go back to my home dashboard, and I'm going to go to Manage Access Tokens. I'm going to create a new token for myself for my 2022 Web Services integration, and click Save. Note that I'm using the administrator role. If you're not in the administrator role, you just need to make sure that your role has access to the REST Web Services permission. The role also needs the permission for logging in using access tokens. Okay, now let's start Postman. Okay, in case you haven't used Postman before, I'll quickly explain it. Postman is an integration testing tool that basically simulates the other end of the integration. So in other words, you're creating an integration with NetSuite so that some other system can read and post data to it, right? Well, here, Postman is that other system. So a good place to start testing this is to get an existing customer record. So let's create a new GET request. And the first thing we need is the URL. So to find the URL, let's go to Setup, Company, Company Information in a new tab, and look on the Company URLs tab. Copy this part of the URL. This will be the first half of the URL of your GET request. So here, if I scroll back up to the top of the documentation, we'll see the second part of the URL that we need. this /services/rest record v1. So I pasted that in here. Now if we go back down to the customer section, we see that the final part of the path is just /customer. Now before we send this, we need to set up our authentication. So let's go to authorization. We're going to set the type to OAuth 1.0, which basically means token-based authentication. And we're going to say add authorization data to the request header. We're going to set the signature method to HMAC SHA-256. And now this is where we copy in our credentials from NetSuite. So first the integration consumer key, then the consumer secret, then our access token key, and the token secret. Finally, scroll down, and we need to set your NetSuite account number in this realm field here. If you're in a test account like I am, make sure to use uppercase letters. Let's go ahead and try sending this and see what happens. Okay, great, it worked. So when we just send a request like this, we get back a list of all customers, or at least the first 1,000 of them here. So now, but what if I wanted to get a specific customer? Let's go to my list of customers. Let's choose this customer, Mose Wilkinson. I can see here that their ID is 17040. So I'm just going to add that on to the end of the URL here and send it again. And this is how we get the JSON for a specific customer record. Now let's look at this JSON that it returned for us for this customer. We basically have all the fields from the customer here, their AR aging information. Now there's a lot of gibberish here that you probably won't need, but if we look through the JSON, we should see some stuff we recognize here, like their name and email address. So this is great. Now let's move on to see how to create a new customer. Let's switch back to the documentation for just a second. So here, if we scroll down just a little bit, it shows that if we want to insert a record, we need to do a POST request. And from here, we can drill down to see what the request body needs to look like. Now don't worry, this isn't all required. This is more like a list of everything you can send. I'm going to show you how to start from scratch, so let's go back to Postman. So starting with our URL, let's change the request type to POST, and let's get rid of this customer ID at the end. Now let's do a save as. Now let's go to the body tab of the request. We're going to set the format to raw JSON. Now let's say we just want to create a new test customer called Robbie Test Company. From looking at the JSON of our previous GET request, we could assume that doing that might look something like this. So let's send this and see what happens. Okay, NetSuite says that I'm missing a required value. That totally makes sense. I'll mention that one of the best things about this API is that it actually has really good error reporting. It is usually really good at telling you what you've done wrong, which is really nice. And generally, the error messages you see will mirror what you will see in the NetSuite user interface. So a good troubleshooting procedure is to try doing something in the user interface if you struggle with doing it here and see how it goes there. If you can do it in the interface, you should be able to do the same thing here. So it says we're missing the primary subsidiary. Let's go back to our get customer JSON and see what the subsidiary looks like in the JSON. So you probably know the subsidiary field is a drop-down in NetSuite. You have to select subsidiaries from a list. So when we want to set a drop-down field, we need to either specify the value as an internal ID or as an external ID. So here we can see that this customer is part of the Honeycomb Manufacturing subsidiary ID 1. I'm going to copy and paste this block, and I'm going to delete this links attribute because we don't need that here. Now I don't actually need to include this ref name, but it helps me to know what subsidiary this is, so I'm going to leave it here. Now if I send this, I get back a blank 204 response. This actually means it worked. You might be expecting to get back the ID of the record that was created. It turns out that the ID is actually embedded in one of the headers here. Looks like it's in the location header here at the end, 17443. So great, we've created a new customer. Now let's look at updating an existing record. I'm going to copy this ID, and save this request, and to update a record we need to change it to a patch request and put the ID at the end. So let's do a save as. Now for updating our customer, let's say we just want to update the comment field on the customer. I can delete the subsidiary bit. Let's just change it to comments. Best customer ever. And now let's send this in and see what happens. Okay, we got back a blank 204 response again, so that means it should have worked. Let's go into NetSuite and take a look at this customer. Just refreshing my list of customers, this one is now at the top, sorted by internal ID. So yep, here's the customer and here's my comment. So let's do something a little more complicated now. Let's look at what it looks like to set the address on the customer. As before, let's start by looking at our get customer response. If I scroll up, we find the address book section here. And if we look, there's a link to get the address book here in the JSON. So let's get that now. Just going to use this. I'm going to send this request. Okay, so now here's a link to an address book item. Let's get that. Going one layer deeper here. So this looks like what we see when we look at the line of the address on the customer. Let's just view our Mose Wilkinson customer here so I can show you what we're talking about. So here, looking at the address, we see, default shipping, default billing, and the address label. So it looks like that's what we've got here. Now we have one more layer to get the actual address book address. So I'll get that here. Okay, finally here we have the actual address data. That's a little crazy to get through, so let's recap. We started at the customer, we went to the address book, to the line in the address book, and finally to the address of the address book line. I'm going to go ahead and save this as get customer address. Okay, now let me show you how this comes together in our patch request. I'm going to paste in a JSON blob and we'll talk about it. So what we do is we form an address book with an array of items each item containing an address book address. It's a little bit ridiculous, but here it is. So let's send it. Okay, we got back our response 204, so let's go refresh our new test customer. And here's the address. So that worked. Great. Okay, let's now move on to sales orders. So like before, the first thing we're going to do is get an existing sales order. So let's look up a sales order ID to get. Let's just get this most recent one from a couple of days ago. And I'm going to start it from my customer GET request. And I'm just going to replace customer with sales order and put in the sales order ID here. I'm going to do a save as. And then let's send this request. So similar to the customer request, here's the JSON that represents this sales order. Here's the customer, here's the subsidiary, and here's the items list. Let's drill into this items list similar to how we did the customer address book. So the first link gets us up to the items sublist itself. And now we can use this link to get the details of the first item line. It looks like they're one-based here. So these are the details of the item line. Now let's see if we can use this information to create a new sales order. First I'm going to save this. So let's do like we did before. We'll start with our GET request. We'll change the request type to a post, and we'll remove the sales order ID. We'll do a save as. So to create our sales order, let's again set the body type to raw JSON. And I'm just going to copy and paste some JSON in here. This is what I think might be the bare minimum for creating a sales order. We need to specify who the customer is, and we need to list at least one item. So here I've listed an item by ID, and I'm just going to say quantity 1. So let's go ahead and try sending this and see what happens. Okay, so we got an error. No surprise here, really. The error says that the DEA blank is required on line 1. Here. Okay, so that's a value related to the T3 pedigree module that I have installed. So let's look again at the line details of the existing sales order to see how we can do that. Now you might run into something totally different, but this is a good exercise nonetheless. So I can see that custom columns here are just listed out. So what I need to do is just get the ID of that column. So I'm just going to go into NetSuite to get it. Here it is, DEA blank. So I'm just going to copy and paste in that column here. Let's try sending it again. Okay, great. We got a 204 empty response, which means it worked. And again, if we look at the header, we see our sales order ID here. Let's take a quick look at this order in NetSuite and see how it came out. So here it is, a fresh sales order with today's date on it. So that's great. Here's the item that I added. So now what if we want to update this order and change the quantity on the line? First, as before, we need to change our request after saving it from post to a patch. And we need to add on the sales order ID to the URL. And we'll do a save as. As you can see, I'm building up a nice list of example requests here. Now on the body, we're not changing the customer, obviously, so we can delete that part. And on the item line, let's just try changing the quantity from 1 to 2. We'll send that in. It says it worked. Let's take a look. Uh-oh. That didn't work. It actually added a second line to the order. So let's clarify. Instead of setting an item here on our line, let's specify that it's line 1 that this block of JSON relates to. Now we'll send that. Okay, we got a response 204. And now it worked. So that's how we specify which line of a sales order we want to update. Okay, so that's creating and updating a sales order done. Now let's switch gears slightly. We're going to talk about SuiteQL. I'm going to show you an example of doing a SuiteQL query, but before we do that, let's just take a quick look at the help section for SuiteQL. I'm going to go into the main SuiteQL page, and let's look at the page on SuiteQL syntax and examples. There are some really nice simple examples here to get you started. Let's go to the page that talks specifically about SuiteQL in REST Web Services. It's under Using SuiteQL and Using SuiteQL with SuiteTalk REST Web Services. And I'll mention here that the error reporting with SuiteQL isn't quite as helpful as the rest of REST Web Services. For example, if you don't have permission for what you're looking for, you might get an error message saying back that the record type doesn't exist, when really it means that you don't have access to that record type. So let's see if we can actually get this query to work in our REST Web Services. Note what it says here about this prefer transient setting. We can see here that we need to do a post. I'm going to start from my post sales order, and I know we need to change the URL. It looks like it's rest/query/v1/SuiteQL. And let's just paste in this body that we've copied here, deleting these periods from the text. I'm going to do a save as. So this query looks like it's going to select all transactions grouped by email, show me the email and by count. So let's go ahead and send it and see what it says. Okay, so we got a message saying the required request header prefer is missing or invalid. So that tells me that we do need to set a prefer header with this word transient. Go ahead and do that. Okay, let's send it again. Okay, so it worked now. So I got a list of items back. So this means that there were 2 transactions with this email, 8 with this email, 4 with this email, so on and so forth. That's pretty cool. I can see that there were 370 results. And if there were more than 1,000 and I wanted to get the next batch, we can add on these limit and offset options in the URL. So if I send it again, saying to only get 10, that comes back with only 10 results. If I want to say get the next 10, I can set the offset to 10. And there we go. Pretty cool, huh? I also wanted to mention that if you want to explore more with SweetQL, Tim Dietrich has published a really cool bundle for free called the SweetQL Query Tool. Once you install it in your NetSuite, you get this SweetQL tab that just has a link to his Suitelet. So to use it, you can manually enter any SweetQL you want, or you can use the library that he's provided here to get some examples. So for example, if you want to see all the customers with an overdue balance, we can find a query for that here. Click Load, and it populates the whole text for the SweetQL query here. If I say Run Query, it gives us back all the data in a nice table here. This is a very cool tool. Thank you very much, Tim. So this concludes our tutorial for now. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you at SweetWorld.